August 7th, 2026. Picture a gilded hall in Mecca where three major governments just signed a sentence that has literally kick-started most of the alliances in modern history. An armed attack against any one of the three states shall be regarded as an attack against them all. But then, just a few days later, before the sun even came up on August 18th, Israeli aircraft dropped a series of strikes onto a runway in northwestern Syria. And according to Israel, it was a runway that forces from one of those newly allied nations, Turkey, were prepping to use. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're skipping the usual preamble and jumping straight in, because we need to look at a massive, brand new defense pact that completely failed to trigger when a member's project was bombed. So I want to pose this core question directly to you. If a member of a brand new mutual defense pact has just had something it really cares about destroyed, does the pact actually do anything? To really grasp the weight of this, we've got to look back at what happened on August 7th. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan signed the Mecca Joint Defence Agreement. It was this huge, historic moment, pulling together massive military capabilities under that one singular, powerful clause. An attack on one is an attack on all. Sounds pretty ironclad, right? Okay, let's dive into this. 11 days. Exactly 11 days. That is literally all it took for this brand new treaty to be put to the test. Just 11 days after the ink dried in Mecca, Israeli aircraft bombed the al-Duhur airbase in Syria, which was this derelict runway that Turkey was actively rehabilitating. So you're probably wondering, did this sweeping, historic defense pact do anything at all to prevent or respond to the strike? Well, the answer is a resounding no. And understanding exactly why the answer is no, that's going to tell us more about how collective defense actually works in the real world than any smiling summit photograph ever will. Section 1. 8 strikes in Syria. Let's look at the specific incident. You see, a runway isn't just a symbol on a map. It's a military capability with a very real radius. And this situation brilliantly illustrates exactly what was at stake. The Abu al-Duhur airbase sits in Syria's Idlib governorate. It's roughly 50 kilometers southwest of Aleppo, and reporting places it about 300 kilometers from Israeli-controlled territory. Now, this base had been completely out of service for years during Syria's war. But Turkey, who is a principal backer of the current government in Damascus, had been rehabilitating it. And this geographical reality is absolutely vital. An airfield that works is a totally different beast from one that doesn't. It can host aircraft, air defense, radar, but most importantly, once foreign personnel are actually stationed on it, striking that base stops being just a strike on Syria. It instantly becomes a strike on somebody else's soldiers. Now, as you might expect, the narratives surrounding this event are in complete, flat contradiction. We're getting two very different stories. On one side, Israel confirmed the operation and laid out their justification. The Israeli Prime Minister's office stated that Israel and Syria actually had an agreed status quo regarding security matters, and that Syria was on the verge of breaching it by letting Turkish troops deploy at this airbase. Israel said they repeatedly warned Syria this was an imminent threat and that those warnings were just ignored. But on the flip side, Ankara and Damascus completely reject that entire premise. Turkey called the allegations totally baseless, saying it was just an attempt to legitimize unlawful strikes on Syrian sovereignty. And Syrian Foreign Minister Asaad al-Shaibani stated plainly that there was absolutely no Turkish military buildup planned for the base whatsoever. Section 2. The warning chain. Because in geopolitics, the order of events is the argument. Let's walk through this timeline because it plays out almost like a ticking clock. We start with the Mecca Pact signed on August 7th. Exactly a week later, on August 14th, Reuters reported a really crucial phone call between Mossad Director Roman Gofman and Syrian Foreign Minister al-Shaibani, and they were specifically discussing the expansion of Turkish military assets in Syria. Then, a quiet, tense 4-day countdown. On August 17th, a Turkish military delegation actually arrives to inspect the base, a visit that Syrian officials claimed was just connected to rehabilitating the runways. But mere hours after that delegation left, overnight between the 17th and 18th of August, those 8 strikes hit the tarmac. And the rhetoric that followed the strikes, it was incredibly blunt. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu characterized his prior warning to Turkey as just a single word, don't. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz went even further, making remarks about President Erdogan's dangerous adventures in Syria. But it's so important that we analyze this language as evidence, not just political theater. Think about it. A deterrent message that you have to repeat using military ordnance is a deterrent message that structurally failed the first time around. And it's worth noting, this action was definitely contested internally. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak publicly called the strikes reckless. But the undeniable structural fact remains. Deterrence failed, and the bombs fell. Section 3. The Mecca Defense Pact. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the treaty that was supposedly governing the region during these strikes. Look at the combined force of the Mecca Joint Defence Agreement. Between Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, you are looking at roughly 1.4 million active personnel. It's staggering. They command 3,415 aircraft, over 6,000 tanks, and have a combined annual defense budget of $124.4 billion. And each member brings something totally distinct to the table, right? Turkey has one of NATO's largest militaries, Saudi Arabia brings immense financial weight, and Pakistan brings the incredibly unique status of being a nuclear-armed state. On paper, it's honestly one of the most consequential security instruments signed in the Middle East in a generation. And here, right here, is the profound tension of this whole explainer. On one side, you have a $144 billion, 1.4 million strong military alliance. And on the other, you have a derelict airfield, highly localized, empty concrete that's been out of service for years. How does a regional superpower alliance just sit back and watch its infrastructure investments get cratered by a foreign military without triggering some massive coordinated response?
Section 4. Territory versus ambition. This is where we uncover the gap between what a country wants to protect and what international law actually allows it to protect.
Get ready for the loophole reveal. Read the clause of the treaty carefully. An armed attack against any one of the three states. Well, in the rigid language of international treaties, a state is defined strictly by its territory. The runway at al-Duhur is not Turkish territory, it's Syrian territory. And Syria? They aren't a signatory to the Mecca Agreement. Plus, remember that timeline? The Turkish inspection delegation had already packed up and left. Because there were 0 Turkish personnel present and the bombs hit Syrian dirt, the Mecca clause was legally irrelevant. Treaties protect territory. They do not protect projects. So the crucial point is that a collective defense treaty is exactly as wide as its text, and absolutely no wider. And this isn't some weird flaw unique to the Mecca Agreement. NATO's famous Article 5 actually has a companion article that specifically bounds it geographically, which has caused decades of headaches and arguments over out-of-area operations. Literally every defense treaty faces this exact test. What happens when something a member deeply cares about, but that sits outside of their borders, gets hit? In this case, none of the 3 Mecca signatories even attempted to invoke the agreement because the text simply did not cover a construction project on foreign soil. Section 5, the deconfliction mechanism. If the Grand Treaty wasn't the instrument operating here, what was? Let's look at what's actually functioning on the ground right now. Look at the diplomatic maneuvering that kicked into gear immediately after the dust settled. The United States, obviously a very close ally of Israel, actually came out and openly criticized the strikes. Tom Barrack, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria, flat out called the strikes an unnecessary escalation. But more importantly, he announced that Washington was working to establish a deconfliction mechanism among Israel, Turkey, and Syria. Now, a deconfliction mechanism is not some grand, sweeping defense guarantee. It's essentially a red telephone line. It's designed to stop militaries that are operating in the exact same airspace from colliding by accident. So, as we look forward, there are 3 distinct indicators you should be watching, rather than just listening to political speeches. First, watch the concrete. Is the runway rebuilt? And by whom? Because concrete is a lot more honest than press communiques. Second, watch for the actual stationing of Turkish personnel. If Turkish troops are ever permanently stationed on that tarmac, an attack instantly changes from hitting empty concrete to killing treaty member soldiers. And that is the exact threshold where the Mecca Pact gets genuinely, truly tested. Third, keep an eye on that proposed U.S. deconfliction channel. Watch to see if it actually gets built with agreed formal procedures. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to take away from this explainer. Grand alliances with gilded signing ceremonies, they always make the front page. But unglamorous, quiet deconfliction lines, the simple phone channels brokered by third parties, they often do far more real, heavy-lifting diplomatic work in holding back a wider confrontation. As global military pacts continue to form and evolve, we really have to ask, will the next major geopolitical disagreement be settled by a quiet phone call on a deconfliction line, or by ordnance dropped in the middle of the night? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep your eyes on how the mechanics of global defense actually work.